Okay, full house. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bob Attardi. I'm the programs director of Politics and Prose. To the friends of Aaron and Justine and the friends of the store, thank you so much for being a part of our community. You know we are a literary and cultural hub for the community and appreciate your support for our author talks that bring together us to share ideas, stories, and experiences. I'm especially delighted to introduce our author today, Aaron Hamburger. I've had the good fortune to work with Aaron for the last 5 years, presenting his popular creative writing classes and his literature classes for the bookstore, and learning alongside you, some of you, our book community, exploring some of his favorite authors. So he's done Philip Roth for us, E.M. Forster, George Orwell, Joan Didion, Christopher Ishwood, Tom Stoppard, and his next class is on Claire Keegan, the brilliant Irish writer. Aaron is locally based author, educator here in Washington, D.C. Aside from teaching at Politics and Prose, he taught creative writing at his alma mater, Columbia University, as well as New York University and the Stone Coast MFA program, and currently is a professor at George Washington University. In his writing career as an author, he was awarded the Rome Prize by the Academy of Arts and Letters for his collection of stories, The View from Stalin's Head. His two previous novels, Faith for Beginners, and the Lambda Literary Award nominee, Nirvana is Here, which he presented here, was a bronze medal winner in 2019 for Forward Indies Awards. So today we celebrate Aaron's new novel, Hotel Cuba. The main characters of this historical novel are Pearl Kahn and her younger sibling Frida. They sail for America, fleeing the chaos of World War I in Lithuania and the terror of the Soviet Revolution. But discriminatory immigration laws bar their entry to America, and they're turned back and they head for Cuba. They experience Prohibition-era Havana, far from the rural shtetl where they grew up. Along the way, they encounter friendships, betrayals, heartbreak, but always looking forward. I told Aaron I love that phrase in his book because, oh, how's that? All right, so one thing you never want to do is have your phone on during an event. Again, this heroic family story explores the profound courage of two women displaced from their home who strive to create a new future in a different and dangerous world, and they stay true to their family beliefs. I'm reminded of Joan Didion's famous quote, we tell ourselves stories in order to live. Storytelling is the heart of the human experience. In Hotel Cuba, we have a story Aaron eloquently says in the promo his publisher, HarperCollins, released about the book that is inspired by his grandparents' immigration stories. His Jewish grandmother traveled from rural Russia to Cuba in 1921 and then to America, and the challenges she faced: economic depression, racial and gender discrimination, and a world war in the midst of her search for personal freedom. In Aaron's hands, this novel is artful, thoughtful, a story deeply researched, and powerfully engaging. And here for you to pick up a signed copy today and start reading. Aaron will be in conversation with Justine Kenin. She's an editor for NPR's All Things Considered, a writing teacher, a kid's book author. He grew it. Let's eat it. And I love that she always says, I would almost always rather be reading. Please welcome our reader-writer friends to Politics and Prose, Aaron and Justine.
Hello. So exciting. First of all, it's super exciting because I'm here with Aaron, which I just love. I've known Aaron for a long time, and when he first told me about this book, we were downstairs, and it was an idea. And so it's so fun that we're back here, and now it's a whole book, and it's a terrific book. The plan for today is just to hear from Aaron about the book and hear some reading. If you have questions, file them away. We'll have some time for questions. There's a mic here, which you'll need to go to. if that's a hard journey, then you can just raise your hand and we can repeat the question because it's being taped. So anyway, Aaron, this is so great. So let's give us your elevator pitch for the book. Tell us the pitch for Hotel Cuba.
All right. Well, thank you. Thanks to Politics and Prose. Thank you, Justine, for doing this with me. And thank you to all of you for coming. I was like, is anybody going to come today? So this is so beautiful. First of all, I have to take a picture because, come on. Got to take a picture. This is a beautiful crowd. So, let me see. I think, okay. All right. Everybody wave. Okay, awesome. There we go. Hey. Okay. Oh, and I have some postcards if people would like a little souvenir. Mm-hmm. So, and it has a QR code on it. I learned how to make a QR code, so I'm very excited about that. So let me tell you about the journey of this book. 6 years ago, I came across this photograph of my grandmother, and I'll pass it around. For those of you who can't see it, this is my grandmother in 1922 in full male drag. Now, the thing you have to know about my grandmother was that she was, when I knew her, growing up, she was like a Yiddish bubby. She would, make cookies for me and have Hershey's Kisses on the counter, and she would always be, singing me lullabies and stuff. She was, and always, dressed in a skirt, very traditional woman. So when I saw that picture of her in male drag, I had to know who was this woman and how did that happen? So I started diving into her story, and it was absolutely just incredible, all the details of it. So I want you to imagine a young woman. She's the daughter of a cantor from a traditional Russian Jewish shtetl. And in a few short years, this shtetl gets hit by war, famine, pogroms, the Russian Revolution. It is just absolutely devastating. And I don't think we can even imagine. If you see photographs from that time, you might think that you are seeing photographs from, the worst of the Holocaust. I mean, it's really just awful. She has to get away. But in 1921, America is changing its laws to keep out immigrants exactly like her. So instead, she decides to go, of all places, the sultry, tropical getaway of Havana, Cuba. Oh, and this is, by the way, during Prohibition, when Americans are flooding Cuba to get drunk. So it's like Mardi Gras on steroids. So my grandmother goes with her sister. They get there, and after 6 months, she pays an American couple to pretend that she is their daughter so they can smuggle her to Key West. They get to Key West, and the second she gets off the boat, a man in a uniform points at her and says, "Halt, there's something wrong with you." She's arrested, and she is detained for 2 weeks and eventually deported back to Cuba without a penny to her name. So that's the story. These are the facts of what happened, and then that's what sort of made me want to turn it into a novel. So
I love that. So like you took this, what you thought was a germ, and made it this, sort of fictionalized, trying to get to know your grandma better. Is that a bit of, because some things you knew and some things you didn't know, and and so to get back to the photo, you had sort of the photo, you had the grandma you knew, mm-hmm. and then you had, tell us about the tapes.
So luckily, and my brother Paul is here. So he and my brother Daniel, back in about the mid-'70s, and maybe it was coinciding with the bicentennial or something, I don't know why, but they decided to interview my grandparents about their immigration stories. And nobody had ever talked about this. My mother said growing up, she never talked with her parents about their immigration story. It was World War II, the Depression. It was a time when you were trying to assimilate, and you weren't trying to sort of, you're trying to fit in. You're not trying to figure out how you were different. And so my grandparents started talking about their stories. My grandfather he owned a grocery store. He was a real kind of raconteur. He was in his element. He was talking and talking. My grandmother was a woman of few but emphatic words. And so she really laid out like the basic outlines of the journey with a few sort of like pregnant details. And she even mentions this photograph, by the way, in the recordings, but she doesn't explain why she is dressed that way. She just says that she's dressed that way. So that made me even more curious to try to figure out, well, then why was she dressed this way? How did she get to Key West? What was she doing in Cuba? What was it like? And for me, the thing that really caught my imagination was coming from a sort of very cloistered Russian, landlocked, wintry, muddy shtetl, going from there to Cuba. Like, what did she think of the music, the food, the language? Like, how did all the culture shock? Like, what did she make of it? And what I was amazed to find out was that there were actually quite a lot of Jewish immigrants who went through this experience because when they changed the immigration laws in 1921, the steamship companies were losing money because they were making so much money from all these immigrants who were coming across. So they started marketing. They said, well, you can't get to America, but why not Cuba? Why not Mexico? Why not Argentina? They're pretty close. It's kind of the same hemisphere. And also there was a loophole in the law that was originally passed in 1921, which was if you were coming from Eastern Europe, there were severe quotas. But if you were coming from Cuba, there wasn't. So if you could establish residency in Cuba, you were no longer subject to the same quotas, and then you could have an easier time getting in. They eventually changed that law again in 1924. And there was a community of Jewish people who came to Cuba, and they ended up staying there until the time of Castro. When Castro came in, they went to Florida, and they are now called Jubans. They're proud Jubans, and they have a community in Miami. I don't know it that well because it's sort of outside the purview of my story, but it's just interesting where people end up, winding up these immigration patterns.
Let's hear a little story. Let's get a little reading. Can we start there?
Absolutely.
And then
Got to get the reading glasses.
Yeah,
on.
yeah. Good thing I have 20/20
This is what happens
vision.
when you get older. Wear the reading glasses. All
I'm
right.
going to set it up. Oh, you're reading from the beginning?
Yes, I'm just
Yay.
going to read from the beginning of the book, so there's nothing you need to know. Fish and oranges. A salty sea of soup dotted with islands of potato chunks that Pearl can mash flat with the back of a spoon. Bread so dry, when she dunks it into her lukewarm soup, the stubborn roll remains firm. But Pearl can be stubborn too. She continues dunking the roll until it softens and melts into a paste. It's depressing, the food on this boat they call SS Hudson. Heavy on salt and light on pepper, parsley, or any herb to give it character, like the shaggy dill in her yard back in Russia, or what used to be Russia. Because this year, 1922, their town belongs to Poland. After a good rain, those dill stalks grow so high, they collapse under their own weight. Starving, blue-eyed soldiers from the Tsar's army used to pull them out by the roots, mistaking them for carrots, then fling them to the ground. Eat, says Pearl, offering an orange to her younger sister, Frida, sitting with her eyes closed and squeezing her temples, or save it for later. Don't bother, says Frida. I won't eat it then either. You can't starve all the way to Cuba. Maybe Pearl sounds more like a nagging mother than a sister, but she quit worrying about her own vanity years ago when Mama died, after giving birth to Frida. Though Pearl was only 9 then, people already called her old lady, housewife, empress of the kitchen, Madame Singer sewing machine. What will they call her in Havana, where no one knows her and she has no history? She might be anything. It's a thrilling, terrifying thought. Before the war, a girl from Turia who'd immigrated to America returned to visit as a rich lady. Some women laughed behind her back, mimicked her proud walk, lifted their hair to imitate her short haircut, and called her new woman as an insult. But Pearl didn't laugh. Maybe someday she too would become a kind of new woman, like this shtetl girl who transformed into a prosperous American lady who could afford to coolly ignore the other's jokes, as if she didn't hear. Now there was freedom. Frida, who's in one of her states, won't eat, no matter what Pearl says. Arguing with her is like trying to empty the ocean with a spoon. So Pearl returns to her own soup. Tomorrow, she'll eat the next soup, and then the one after that, and the one after that. In this way, always looking forward, never back, she and this creaking boat will slowly cross the Atlantic, leaving Europe behind. When Pearl finishes her bowl, she's still hungry. She has long been cursed with a healthy appetite. Her solid, sturdy figure bulges in the wrong places for a woman who loves dainty clothes, loves looking at them, loves making them. Before the Great War, when people cared what they looked like, Jews and Gentiles alike paid her to make dresses sewn with fine stitches you need a magnifying glass to see. For each dress she made, Pearl imagined a story, the potential to put on a new outfit and become a new person. But sadly, clothes never fit her as beautifully as they do slender Frida, who even before the boat often forgot to eat. Pearl has never forgotten to eat in her life. During the worst of the Great War and then the Revolution and war with Poland after, her hunger was so raw, it addled her thoughts, gnawed at her stomach lining. On the SS Hudson, many passengers are seasick like Frida. Pearl squeezes sideways between tables, casually skims stray peas and carrot knobs from abandoned bowls of soup, scrounges a section of orange, a scrap of pinkish-brown herring. A willowy lady wearing a dusty pink hat watches her at work, out of pity or disgust. She's a sophisticated city type. Jews are so desperate to leave Europe these days, they cross the ocean in a bathtub. So Pearl sees many grand people like her mixed with the country folk in steerage. This lady has a long, lovely face, pale with a pointed chin, and shrewd gray-green eyes like a cat. Pearl noticed her when she came into the dining room on the arm of a young man who pulled out a chair for her. She stepped forward and sat, didn't even look behind her, confident the chair would be pushed in again. And it was. Pearl imagines what it would be like to have that kind of confidence, to sit into air and know that a seat would appear below you. And that hat, it fires up her imagination. If Pearl could afford to wear a fancy pink hat like that, she could walk down the street with such a cold, blank stare, no one would bother her. She's known plenty of women who aren't strictly beautiful, but in the right hat or dress, they're magnificent. Their clothes teach the world to treat them with dignity. The pink lady notices Pearl staring, gives her an inquisitive look, and Pearl, who feels a puzzling itch to capture this exquisite woman's attention, surprises herself by nervously extending a roll and asking, "Maybe you want half?" In response, the woman averts her eyes. "It's all right," says Pearl, fearing she's committed a blunder, but unable to stop herself. "You can have the whole thing if you want." "I'm afraid I'm not very hungry." Looking as if she smelled something rotten, the woman rises and leaves the table, followed by her male companion. Pearl returns meekly to her seat. What was she thinking, speaking out this way? "This food's awful," she tells her sister. "If they let me in the kitchen, I could do better." "I heard you," says Frida. "The way you talk, it's embarrassing." "What did you hear?" Pearl suspects her sister's right, but doesn't like to admit it. She lacks her sister's talent, if you can call it that, for small talk. Frida grabs a roll and shoves it rudely at Pearl's chest. "Go on, have it." "That's not how someone with manners speaks. Didn't you see that expensive dress she had on? Didn't you hear her pretty accent? Imagine what she thinks of us." The back of Pearl's neck prickles with shame. I've gotten it wrong again, she thinks. But what if the pink lady wasn't offended, just jealous? Because Pearl was brazen enough to do whatever she felt like. If that lady wasn't so polite, she'd pick up scraps too. Polite people don't survive in this world. "We're from plenty good stock," says Pearl. "Father's from Lithuania." "Where we're going, they've probably never heard of Lithuania," says Frida, pushing back her chair. "I can't sit here anymore. My stomach's not at all well." "I'd better come with you," says Pearl. Clinging to the shaky, narrow railings, the two sisters descend 3 flights of metal stairs into the ship's belly. Day or night makes no difference in the enormous room where they sleep, 3 times the size of a synagogue, crammed with endless rows of iron berths stacked with lean mattresses. Kerosene lamps put up a feeble fight against the darkness. Pearl and Frida have claimed 2 narrow beds by the wall. They take turns holding up a blanket while changing their clothes. Not everyone is so delicate, and Pearl's eye occasionally catches the white curve of a stranger's breast or rump. Once, Frida wasn't paying attention to the blanket and exposed Pearl's body. "Raise it higher, higher," Pearl hissed, imagining everyone staring at her fleshy, hairy arms, her dark-toned skin, the color of rye bread. But she wouldn't allow herself to cry, not for all to see. "Was it really so terrible how I spoke to that lady?" Pearl asks. "Leave it be," says Frida. She climbs into her bed, pulls her knees to her chin, and faces the wall to retreat into her sullen self, silent as a widow. It's wearying, the engine's eternal clanking, strangers' anxious chatter, and days of seeing only sea and sky around their ship. Pearl's ears ache, filled with the constant roar of ocean. Focus on other things, she thinks. A warm, freshly laid egg, or, yes, a dusty pink hat. But then the ship hits a rolling wave, someone screams or tumbles to the floor, and she's back in the present, lost on an ocean.
I love that.
Thank you.
You get so much of, you do such a beautiful job in this section, but throughout, of Pearl as sort of, mama to Frida, but also she's a kid.
Yeah.
And her, and that sort of, how did you figure that out? Was it just as you were writing? But because she's really a kid herself, and there's an excitement for her, right? Like she gets to, for the first time in hundreds of years, somebody's leaving the shtetl, and she's going to Cuba even though she knows nothing there.
Yeah.
Talk more about that.
People had to grow up real fast in those days. You didn't have a choice. And so in the book, Pearl is 9, and her mother is pregnant, and her mother has been advised by the doctor not to get pregnant again, but she does. And she goes to a slightly bigger city to have the baby where there might be better medical care. And then Pearl is summoned to meet with her mother. Her mother dies, leaves the baby, and Pearl has to bring the baby, who is her sister Frida, back to the village at 9 years old, which is actually based on a true story that happened to my grandfather and his younger brother. But it was such a good story, I gave it to my grandmother. But it really was true. There was no sort of like carefree childhood in those days because the times were just so awful and so unpredictable. And, people just had to do whatever they could to survive, and they had to grow up fast. And, in the case of this story, Pearl has to be her own mother, and she has to be Frida's mother, and she's still just a kid. So
yeah, and I still hear in that, though, her working stuff out. And I think also in this exposure by being on the boat and by imagining themselves somewhere else and looking at that other woman, seeing her like another self and like trying to imagine herself into a new reality.
100%. And, the other thing that is a factor here is the role of education and girls and women. So girls did not get very much education in the world of the shtetl. It was the boys who got the education. Girls were taught to basically, they could write their names, they could read, they could do like maybe some basic math, and that was it. There was like one book that was sort of like okay for girls to read traditionally, and things were changing, in the shtetl. The weird thing about shtetl life was that there was this mix of like provincialism and then also like a kind of worldliness. Like they put on Shakespeare plays in the shtetl. They would do opera arias. They knew about there was often a hotbed of socialism and revolution. So there was that mix of both kind of like being sheltered and knowing of things. And so I was thinking about Pearl in that respect. Like there would be things that she would be aware of, and then there would be these kind of glaring gaps. But as someone with this kind of like very instinctual intelligence, she would be trying to work things out. And so I really wanted to capture that perspective throughout the book of both this like not knowing and also like trying to put things together and figure things out.
Yeah, and I think it helps that she is so self-aware and is aware of those gaps.
Yes.
And so trying to fill, unlike Frida, who's always sort of, just, kind of a holly-golightly, like,
She's a romantic, you know. And I was telling Justine, there were a lot of influences on me as I was writing this book, but one of them was Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. So you have one sister who's like very kind of like sturdy and almost like the, sensible, the mom of the family. And then this other sister who's more romantic and has her head in the clouds. And so Frida is actually engaged to another young man from their village who did make it into America. And so she really wants to get across the ocean so that she can be reunited with her boyfriend. Pearl doesn't particularly like this guy. The family in general doesn't really like him. But Frida is very strong-willed. She's like determined to get back with this guy.
Yeah, in America, there is America continues to draw, the United States continues to draw them in. As much as Cuba is super appealing. And I do love how you have them still bring some of Cuba to the States. And I was thinking about the if you could talk a little bit about Pearl and her clothes and how, because what she ends up having, tell about how she got the job maybe at first, and then because her sense of self is so strong, and a lot of it comes from the skill from being able to make clothes. I don't even know the words. I don't even know how to make clothes, but just sew. I think just sew is
yeah. So in the book, and as was my grandmother, my grandmother was a skilled seamstress, and Pearl is as well. And like my grandmother, Pearl finds a job in Cuba making hats for a childless middle-aged Jewish couple. And there were a lot of these sort of workshops / sweatshops in Old Town Havana, where a lot of the Jewish immigrants would get this kind of work. I related a lot to this character of Pearl as a creative person. I'm obviously a writer. I have that creative side, and so I imagine Pearl telling stories through the making of the clothes, so that each article of clothing that she's making, she's imagining who's going to wear it, how is it going to transform this person, how is the act of choosing what to wear a kind of definition of identity. And it was fascinating. I did so much research into the fashions of the 1920s. Like, I never thought I'm not particularly fashionable myself, but anyway, I was fascinated by. I didn't realize the color palettes of the time were muted. So you would be wearing pistachio, dusty pink. You'd be wearing mustard yellow, bright colors, day glow. That was like totally out. So I'm imagining Pearl being in Cuba, where the colors, if any of you have been to Havana, the colors are so intense because of the tropical light, the bougainvillea. You can just imagine. And of the landscape I'm talking about. And so you could imagine like seeing those colors and the light and being inspired by that and wanting to create clothing that has those kinds of colors. But that's out in the 1920s, and so anyway, that creates a kind of conflict for her self-expression.
Yeah. One thing that I was fascinated by was in all her, and you sort of as you get into the book and you sort of decide things that might happen, and you try to figure out what's going to happen next. One thing that I thought was super dear to me was that Pearl and Frida, and especially Pearl's observation of all the different ways to be Jewish, because she seemed to only sort of know one or two ways before she left, but she sees like the rabbi that they stay with or she stays with rather in Key West, and I that sense, that exploration that I don't, and she's trying new ways. She's trying to decide, so who am I as a cantor's daughter in Cuba, right? Mm-hmm.
So Pearl has a real crisis of faith during the book. It opens where she's had a really terrible event happens to her. I don't want to give away too much, but it shakes her to her core. And she's trying to cover this up. She doesn't want people to know. And she's trying to figure out, like, why would God let this happen to me? And where is God? And how do I relate to God? And again, she hasn't had like an extensive religious education where people are wrestling with questions of faith in a scholastic kind of setting, and so she's trying to make sense of these very complicated questions while also like working like 6-7 days a week, trying to support herself and trying to get to America, trying to take care of her sister, and all these things. And along the way, she's meeting and hearing about Jews who have different flavors of faith, or Jews who feel comfortable making their own decisions. I'm like picking from a menu.
Yeah.
Like I'll take this one, I won't take that one, and that is like a really foreign idea to her, and an intriguing idea that she's wrestling with during the novel.
Yeah, because she definitely there's and there's like this youthful quality. I feel like in some ways she got to be a kid by getting out. I mean, it gets to sort of explore life in a way that and try on different selves and figure out who she is, which
that was something very much that my editor and I were talking about as we were editing this book, the search for a self, this idea that like when you're an immigrant you can create a new self because you don't have that history, or not everybody you meet knows the history that you bring with you.
It's like summer camp.
Well, yeah, but it's like going to a new place, and it's like, wow, like who am I going to be here, and how much of myself am I bringing with me? And of course, wherever we go, we bring all of our past selves with us. And so part of what she's wrestling with in this novel is how to assimilate her past into her present, and to which parts is she going to bring with her, and which parts is she going to try to leave behind, which parts can she leave behind, because it's impossible to leave all of our former selves behind. So in that way, I think all of us can relate to that. Anyone who's moved even like a block away from the home where we grew up.
Yeah. So if anyone is thinking of a question, might be a nice time to wander over to this microphone.
This
No
lovely
pressure.
microphone
No
here.
pressure. A hand may also be raised because we could do this all day. Where we have lots of thoughts. What I want to note I can't remember, was the intro or somewhere else where you a U.S. senator planted the idea for you to do this book.
Yeah, so right around the time when I got that picture that's like floating around the room somewhere at this point. So it was after the election of 2016, and I felt very concerned about the rights of immigrants. And there was a writing convention here in D.C., and a group of writers decided, let's go to Capitol Hill, and we're going to knock on the doors of every senator from every state and advocate for progressive causes and do what we can. So I volunteered to be the person from Michigan, even though I don't live in Michigan anymore. I grew up there. I still have family there. And so I went to see Senator Debbie Stabenow of Michigan to her office. And I remember I was lining up with all these lobbyists. They were in suits and they had like printed folders. They're very like official looking. And then there's like me, like the dopey writer. And I had this picture of my grandmother. And it was my turn. And I explained, I was part of this writing convention that was here. I'm a writer. And this is my grandmother. She was an immigrant. And I believe strongly in the rights of immigrants. And I hope, you, Senator Stabenow, will support the rights of immigrants as well. And she said, oh, I agree with you. Very Midwestern. Oh, I agree with you 100%. And I thought, boy, that was the easiest lobbying job I've ever heard of. And I said, well, how can I support you in what you're doing? And she said, you're a writer. Tell your grandmother's story. And I thought, well, I'm not a historical novelist, but then it occurred to me later on, all my writing is very intensely steeped in questions of time and place. I'm always fascinated. And in fact, my previous book was set in Detroit in the early 90s, a place that I know well because I grew up there. But I did as much research for that as I did for this one. And so I thought, okay, well, let me try. Let me see if I could do something. And then I went to a reading by a local novelist, Dolan Perkins Valdez, who very generously gave me a blurb for this book. And she writes wonderful historical novels. I remember her talking about her practice, and she said, I write a draft of my story to figure out what I need to figure out. And that freed me. Because then, number one, I just had the courage to just like leap forward and just write the story. But number two, it sort of like limited the scope of my research. Like I didn't have to know everything in the world in 1920. I just needed to know how do you make like a long distance phone call in 1920, or like what is what is that hat called that a woman would wear in 1920? Those like particular details. And so that was really very sage advice, and I'm very grateful to her for offering it. And I see someone is stepping up to the microphone.
I have a question, and I think it segues into what you were just talking about. Can you talk a little bit about, you're writing about not just a historical figure, but a figure that you knew, a person that you knew. And did you ever feel hemmed in or constricted by as a person who was trying to create somebody, by the reality of the person who you knew? And can you talk about the struggle over that as a writer creating somebody who is a fictional character?
Yes, absolutely. So when my editor first bought the novel, the very first question that she asked me is, how willing are you to change the actual facts of the story to make for a better story? And I said, 100%, that's what I've already been doing, and that's what I will continue to do, because this is fiction. And my first responsibility to my readers as a fiction writer is to tell a good, juicy, coherent story. And I think another thing that really helped me with that was that my grandmother was in her 80s and 90s, and I was like a very young child. She died when I was 15. So I didn't know her. I knew her well, but I didn't know her like that well, and that many facets of her, that I felt kind of free to like make her into the character and think about, okay, well, what would she have done? And then the other thing I was interested in was, okay, there's the person who is my grandmother today, but how did she get to be this way? So she was somebody different when she was 20 or 25 or 27 or 30. So what was the journey to get her to this place? So that helped me. And then also, originally I thought maybe doing some more of a nonfiction route with this story, but the problem is like there weren't so many records of everything. So I could see, there was a lot of there were a lot of sources where I could get for like similar kinds of stories or similar sort of things. Like I went to the National Archives and I read the correspondence of the people in the government who were dealing with the question of undocumented immigrants, particularly between Cuba and Florida at the time, which was, I'm sorry to blab on this one, but there was a lot of smuggling going on because of Prohibition, and if you were smuggling rum, you were also smuggling immigrants because it was the same boat. So it was a lot was going on, and a lot of people had things to say about it, and so I was able to draw on that to help flesh out my story. Did I answer your question? Pretty much. Yeah. Okay. Hey, hi, Johannes.
Hey, Aaron.
By the way, everybody should read Johannes's new novel, Calling Ukraine, which just came out like a week ago or 2 weeks ago.
Oh, thank you, Aaron. That's so kind of you. I was hoping you would plug it. That's
Yes, that's why he came up to answer. Yes.
No, but I wanted to ask, you talked about how writing historical fiction is kind of a departure for you, but this isn't the first time you've written about Central or Eastern Europe.
Correct.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role that region, obviously you talked about a different country in a different place, but that region plays in your writing and your approach to literature.
Yes, absolutely. So my first book was set in Prague after the Cold War. And I lived there in 96, 97. And when I went, I was actually very conscious of thinking, this is not where my grandparents came from, but it's like closer, like it's the furthest edge of the Slavic language spectrum from, Russian. But I did get to go to Poland. And I did go, not all the way to Russia. I wanted to go to Russia, but even then, people were talking about how like it was kind of dangerous, and you had to really kind of think about, I kept waiting for that time when Russia would not be like so dangerous to go to, and like I guess that window is closed. But anyway, so yeah, I was very conscious of that, and I think also a lot of the experiences that I felt as an expatriate, as somebody living in a foreign country, helped me to kind of empathize with some of the cultural dislocation. That Pearl would be thinking about going the opposite direction. The other thing, my grandparents loved America. I mean, they were just so grateful to be in a land where like people were not shooting them and not like, the violence was really, it was like random, it was scary, it was terrible. And I used to ask them like questions about like where they came from, and they would always say, God bless America, never go there. Never go there. It's a terrible place. You don't want to go there, which of course made me really curious and wanted to go there. So so I felt like my stay in Eastern Europe brought me like a little bit closer. The other thing was I used to teach English to immigrants in Brooklyn, and a large number of them were Russian and Russian Jews. And we used to have all kinds of incredible conversations about their culture, American culture, and the dislocation and the differences.
And you told me you got to Latvia, but not Lithuania.
Yes, and I got to Latvia, yes, but
right.
not Lithuania. This was another thing that I discovered through my research. Apparently, being from Lithuania is like, ooh, you're from Lithuania. It was like this thing that my grandmother and her sister apparently were quite proud of. I'm not quite sure why, but I'm sure Lithuania is a lovely country, but I don't know why there was something about that. Kind of like I'm from Michigan, and I don't know, apologies if you're from Ohio, but people from Michigan think they are better than people from Ohio. I don't know why, there's like this thing, so there you go. Yes.
Well, we are. No, I'm from Detroit also, and so I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about your book, about Detroit.
Sure.
And given Jewish geography in Detroit, I'm sure my mother knew your family, someone.
Yeah. So the book eventually winds up in Detroit, and one of the things that fascinated me about Detroit was that its nickname was Paris of the West. Detroit was a boom town because of cars. It was like oil. It was like this new industry, and like the only place you could get cars from was Detroit. And they were like put them out, and everybody was buying them. And there was this story, like if you had the uniform of a factory worker, a car factory worker, and you were a guy, you could get any woman that you wanted. I mean, it was like a glamour, and buildings were booming. I mean, it was a real kind of like boom town sort of thing. And the other thing, of course, it was a border town. So guess what was happening during Prohibition? lots of smuggling. So there were also gangs and, mafia to get the alcohol across. So it was a really kind of like fascinating place in a way that I had not quite understood and imagined until I dove into the research.
And I think, I love how, again, my own prejudice coming into the book was, they get to the, I don't want to tell everything, but there's some scenes in New York, and you think like,
Yes.
New York, yes, I've made it. And they're like, this is kind of rough here.
Yeah.
And so Detroit ends up looking like,
Pretty good
promised
compared to
land.
New York.
Yeah.
So, one of the quotes I have from my grandmother does eventually, obviously she makes it to America, I'm here. But so her first reaction when she meets up with her sisters, she had two sisters who were in New York already. She was trying to join them. And she said, when I saw the way my sisters were living, I wanted to go back to Russia. And really, and if you ever go to New York, go to the Tenement Museum, you'll really see, the privation, the poverty, the really terrible conditions it was quite awful. It was quite dirty, and it was difficult living. So, that was very interesting to remark upon as well. Yes.
What do you think your grandparents would think about the United States in 2023?
Ooh, that's a loaded question. That's a really good question. I wish I had like a great answer for that. But what I would say is that my grandparents were very loving people. I think we would agree. And they were people who, they just had open hearts. And my grandfather in particular just believed in like this sort of, so my grandfather was the kind of guy, like I would go and visit him and I would say something like, oh, I tied my shoes. You tied your shoes? How did you do it? Oh, you're so smart. You're so wonderful. Like whatever I did was like the most amazing thing ever. But the thing was, like, I met so many people who met Mike. Oh, your grandfather is like he's the nicest guy. He made me feel so good, And I think that was really the way that they interacted with the world. And so I think what they would say to us today is like, can we be a little kinder to each other than we have been? And what would it take?
I also, if I may. Knowing Pearl a little bit as I do, think she would like your cookies.
Probably. So my grandmother was famous for baking, they were called rock cookies, that were like delicious out of the oven, but like wait an hour and they would be hard as rocks and you could like break your teeth on them. So she was like very good at making like certain things like kreplach and gefilte fish, like very traditional dishes. She was not like a gourmet chef, but she knew what was what. And actually one of the interesting things about listening to these recordings of my grandparents was the things that they got upset about 50 years after the fact. So my grandmother was trying to teach her sister how to cook. It was like a disaster. And my grandfather was saying, and she mixed up the horseradish root and the potatoes. Can you believe it? She mixed up the potato and the horseradish. He's going on about this is 50 years after this meal. He hasn't forgiven her. So that kind of helped me with writing the book because it's like we think of like history, historical fiction, like war, kings, president, people were living their lives. They were worried about like, oh my God, is my soup going to come out okay? And so I tried to really kind of live with my characters on that level.
This could have been from the point of view of your grandfather. You chose the point of view of your grandmother, writing from the point of view of a woman. How much did you think about that, or did you just leap in?
I just kind of leapt in. I tend to write a lot from female characters' point of view. Not all the time, but it happens pretty frequently. And I wish like I had some like answer like specifically like how I did it. But I really, I just identified with Pearl as a creative person. Also as someone who had some trauma in her past that I have had, and I was able to identify with her that way. One of the things, my aunt actually recounts this story. I don't know if you've heard it. She says she remembers that my grandmother told her about hiding in the house in the old country and hearing the cries of women who were being raped by soldiers. And that, just imagine that, it was such a I can't even tell you what a terrible, terrible time and place it was. I think just being able to enter into somebody else's skin and just trying to think about what would you have felt, trying to imagine it, even if you fail, I think is an incredible exercise.
Can we hear a little bit more of the book? Did you have a?
Oh,
Oh,
there's
I'm
a question.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Catherine, do you want to come to the mic?
Or we can repeat it.
Okay, she'll belt it out and Justine will repeat.
So, I was wondering, do you talk much about where she came from? Because where you started, she's on the journey already, but you don't really get much of a picture of what was going on there.
So I'll just repeat it for the
taping.
taping.
Yeah.
Is how much do you get into where she came from? And because she's already on her journey when we open the book.
Yes. So pretty much like right after that section, it's like space break. And then you get like the little backstory to catch you up on like where she's from and all those things. And then also there are little memories that are scattered throughout the book. But there is a section right immediately following that where you do get that. Yeah.
Hey, Aaron. I love the fact you mentioned that Senator Stabenow influenced the book or inspired the book. Are you going to go back and take this to her?
Yes, I'm planning to go to the office, this time with the book in hand and say, and deliver a thank you. I mean, I don't know if she'll be there or not, but definitely I can include a little note. Yeah.
Good.
But can I just say also, like, for you to be open to hearing that? Like, I'm sure, you know what I mean? Like, I'm sure people hear that all the time. Like, oh, you should tell that story. Da, 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 da. You were like noted, and you took it. And I think as an artist, as a creative person, you went, okay, so what would that look like? And who would she be? And what parts of it do I know? And what parts of it do I not know? So I think, applause to you and thank you for being open to that. But I think that's, do you agree as like an artist, that sort of openness as you move through the world?
I think as well, not just as writers or creative people, but in general, like there's this poem by Yehuda Amichai called "The Place Where We Are Right." Is a hard ground; nothing will ever grow there. And so, just being open, like who knows where inspiration is going to come from, and and my first thought was like, oh, no way, but it wasn't a hard no, and I was like, well, maybe, and then and then it turned into this. Hi.
Hi, I'm going to change the subject a little bit,
Okay.
but maybe it follows with what you just said about where your inspiration comes from. I'm interested in how you choose which classes you teach here at Politics and Prose.
Good plug for the classes here. Yes.
I'm really interested in the Claire Keegan one, and I'm
Yeah.
wondering, you've done some interesting people, and how do you come up with those ideas?
Yeah, so it's funny. Bob and Hannah, who I work with at Politics and Prose, they call it Aaron Hamburger's random obsession classes, and it is just sort of just kind of like what I feel like is both like I'm interested in, maybe a little bit in the zeitgeist. So there was a biography of Philip Roth that came out and then became kind of notorious, but I was interested in like revisiting Philip Roth's work, and it turned out that there were a lot of people who were interested in doing that with me, and then that went well. So Bob was like, oh, what do you want to do next? And I'm like, I love E.M. Forster. Let's do E.M. Forster. And he was like, all right. So we did. And there were like tons of people who wanted to read E.M. Forster. And then the Roth people said, can you come back and do Roth? And then we did George Orwell and Joan Didion, just because I felt like they had something to say at the current moment. And yeah, it's really... And then Tom Stoppard, that play Leopoldstadt, actually, which is about a lot of these questions, tracing hidden family history. It came out in New York, and it reminded me how much I love Tom Stoppard. And so, so just kind of keep your eye out on the Politics and Prose calendar. And a lot of these classes are online. You can zoom in from anywhere, and they're a lot of fun.
But the summer books, those are really short books, really fast
Yes,
reading.
we're doing Claire Keegan. If you've never read Claire Keegan, her books are like often like 100 pages, so very short, dense reads. Yes, hey.
Hey, Aaron. My question is about Cuba.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to reading the book. Were you able to go to Cuba and like walk
Yes.
around where she was, and what were your impressions of that coming out of there?
Yeah, so I did go to Cuba in 2017. It was like April of 2017, and so the rules were changing, but they had not yet quite changed.
Yeah.
And first of all, there were so many American tourists. The cruise ships in the harbor were just like huge ships, and Americans coming in for the day and shopping and going to restaurants, and it felt like it was really, it felt like there was a lot of, we're on the cusp of like something changing, big. And then of course things have changed so much. I was really struck, first of all, by the heat and the quality of the heat and the light. And definitely that sort of tropical light, and just thinking about if you come from like a wintry country, experiencing, and a lot of the immigrants who came from Eastern Europe were wearing their best woolen clothes.
God. Yeah.
So they would come, and they they want to make a good impression in the new world. And the first thing they did was like try to get rid of them. They also suffered heat rashes, because they wore inappropriate clothing for the climate. And then the beauty of the architecture, particularly the old town of Havana was where a lot of the immigrants were, and has this beautiful kind of like European Baroque style architecture. And so the contrast of that, and then like the palm trees and the bougainvillea, it's so striking. And then of course the political legacy, the history, the problems that Cuba has to a large extent because of what's going on with the embargo. Every day was complex, fascinating, amazing, heartbreaking, thought-provoking. It was a really complicated trip that I'll never forget. And then one of my favorite moments from it was we had a wonderful tour guide who told me about her grandmother. And she said her grandmother liked every Sunday, she would go for a stroll down the main avenue of Havana where they had beautiful department stores, and she would look at the windows and all the beautiful fashions that she couldn't afford. And this was a popular thing to do. And I thought, what if my grandmother did that too? And so there's a scene in the book inspired by that.
Thank you.
Oh, we got 2 questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, on that, a question about language, either in the book or in real life, I assume that Frida and Pearl are either speaking Lithuanian, Polish, or Russian. And what language did they learn, and how did they do that in Cuba?
So the question is, what language did Pearl and Frida speak? Having to go through Cuba, did they speak Lithuanian, Polish and Russian? Yeah, that's the question. And the answer is
So
Yiddish.
they spoke Yiddish. And the 2 characters, so Pearl is not very good with languages, but her sister Frida is very good. She has like an ear for a language. And she picks up Spanish like really, really quickly. I found out later that actually was sort of true. I interviewed my cousin, who was Frida's son, and he said when his mom was 80 years old, they were in Florida, he took her to a restaurant. There was a Cuban waiter, and his mother started speaking fluent Spanish to the waiter. And then she turned to her son and she said, "Havana is the most beautiful city in the world." And that was not my grandmother's impression. So, but yeah, it was Yiddish, Spanish, and then English when they got to America.
So can you talk a little bit about the Jewish community today in Cuba at all? I mean, can you speak with some of the members of the community?
Can you talk about the Jewish community in Cuba today and what you saw when you were there in 2017?
Yeah, so we visited the synagogue, the current synagogue, which is not historical, like maybe it dates from like the 50s or 60s or something like that. It's a very small community. I think it's maybe like 200 or something. They have a website, and people can go and have tours and stuff. And rabbis were coming from the United States to Cuba. I don't know if that's still the case, to help them with having a Shabbat service and stuff. There was in the olden days, there was a division between the Sephardic Jews and the Ashkenazi Jews. So I'm not sure which branch the Jews of Cuba today are.
Can you tell about the I love the Ezra community and
the
what
Ezra Society?
The Ezra Society, sorry, and how what was happening in Cuba and how that compared to the U.S.
Yes. So there was the Jews who were in Cuba before this influx of immigration came were associated with the sugar trade. Sugar was like huge in Cuba, so they were mostly American Jews. And so when they saw this influx of Eastern European Jews, they created a society called the Ezra Society to meet particularly the young women coming to the docks. They were afraid that they would fall into prostitution. So they would meet them, they would take them to it was called the Mädelheim, a young women's home, and they would give them a place to sleep, they'd give them clothes, a little bit of money, try to teach them some Spanish, and try to set them up with some kind of work. But Cuba was going through a terrible depression at this time because during World War I, sugar prices were very high because of the war, and when the war ended, sugar prices spiked. And there's this amazing story I read of all these ships in Havana Harbor filled with luxury goods that were ordered by these overnight millionaires because of the sugar. And then the prices fell and they couldn't afford to pay for them. And the ships were stuck in the harbor because they couldn't unload the goods because nobody would pay for them. And they were running out of dock space. So they were like anchored like just in the harbor and hanging out and hoping somebody would have the money to pay for the goods.
And do you want to tell us about the title, Hotel Cuba?
Oh. Yeah, so Hotel Cuba was actually, this I think will be our last question. Hotel Cuba was a actual Yiddish expression, and the idea was that these immigrants were coming here. It was just a way station. It was just a hotel. It was a place they were going to stop, and eventually they were going to go to their destination, which was America. But of course, it was not a hotel. It definitely left a mark on everybody who came through Cuba, and also it ended up being a place where a lot of people ended up settling and staying for good. So I wanted to explore how could this experience that was meant to be temporary have a permanent effect.
Well, thank you, Aaron, Justine.
Thank all of you.
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
so much for coming.
So we have